I want to know what's the strangest thing you have in your house.
Yeah, hold on a sec. So this is actually something that my wife desperately felt she needed, and I absolutely agree. And it's a box of teeth.
This is Box of Teeth, chewing over the stories behind the books. With our guest, Maggie Stiefvater.
Hi.
It's always a miracle every time technology works.
Oh, I know. Me too. Okay, so I will officially start our interview. This is our Mr. B's Box of Teeth with Maggie Stiefvater, one of my favorite authors. And where are you calling us from today, Maggie?
I'm calling from my home office in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, so I can see nothing but cows out of my window, cows and a lot of rain.
So I just want to first ask you, do you remember the first day that you found out you were going to be published?
Man, I do. It was a small publisher, and they'd actually turned down my first draft, and I actually have show and tell here because I'm in my home office. So this is my first book. It was published. Oh, can we do this? Maybe. That's Lament. That's a very original cover of it. And you'll notice that it has a piece of paper in it because I keep in this book, it's a copy of my rejection letter for it.
Ah.
From my current publisher, Scholastic. So when I got this call and they said, yes, we want it, go ahead, celebrate. I remember I got into my car and I lived in a little tiny townhouse. And so there wasn't really any place to go, but I just drove my car in circles around the townhouse listening to music. So that was my thrilling moment. I have one other show and tell thing because I would have driven even faster if I'd known how successful I've been later, but also if I had known that I was going to get this Japanese cover for the sequel. Can you see this? All right.
Oh, yeah.
This bad boy, that is the main love interest. He's wearing a purple tracksuit and it's zipped down to his belly button as he's holding his bagpipes. That's what you want out of a man. I mean, I would have been really excited, I think, if I'd known my career was going. I peaked there.
Yeah, the purple tracksuit. Oh, I love it. Do you remember which car you were driving? Because I know you're big on your cars.
It was, oh gosh, it would have been just an old beat up, this is terrible to say this. It was an old beat up beige Toyota Camry, which is the most boring car ever. Later, I did continue to use that car as inspiration, though, because there is a rental car in the Raven Cycle, which is spoken of with such loathing. And in my head, I'm always thinking of that Toyota.
With loathing. Speaking of the Raven Cycle and this insane world of dreamers and Latin-speaking forests, how did that idea, like, your brain for that, how did that all piece together? How did you think of a dreamer that dreamt things into being, a whole forest?
I've always been a big fan of no, that is a lie. I was about to lie to you on camera. I now am a big fan of letting my stories percolate for a long time. It seems to me, the longer it kind of kicks around in my head, the more sophisticated it gets, the more I reject the bits which are just interesting looking set pieces, like the aesthetics, and the more I am interested in the deep themes of it. At the time, though, when I was a teen, this is the reason why it's about to be a lie, I used to think that if you did not write an idea immediately, it would wink out and die forever. It was like a shooting star, it was gone. So if I had a great idea, I would sit down and immediately begin to write it. And it was always awful, always awful. And this was the case of the story of people who brought things out of their dreams, which as an idea, it always amazes me that there's not more novels about people bringing things out of their dreams because it feels so true. So that was the original concept for it. But I actually have one of my old journals that I wrote stuff down when I was 19, and it's got my little tiny ridiculous handwriting in it with my brainstorming. And you can even tell, wait, can I do this? This is terrible. I'll read it for you. It says, the Llewellyn Society begun April 22nd, 2007. This was a different draft by Maggie Stiefvater. And this one was when I finally decided that the Welsh prince I was going to use was a Llewellyn, until I found out that Glendower was a much better choice. He has a real magical backstory as opposed to Llewellyn. I had to invent it entirely. But yeah, so it's been around forever, but it was just too shallow. It was just a thin metaphor back then. So it needed time to kind of gather momentum through the years.
Did Shiver and like all the Crooked Saints, did they percolate that long, or were they?
Yeah, most of them started out as short stories, actually. I'm a big fan of short stories as a way of, now when I get that plot bunny, I throw it down there and it kind of acts like a Polaroid snapshot of what it felt like. The Scorpio Races was just a short story written in an afternoon. Shiver was a short story that was written in an afternoon. And yeah, All the Crooked Saints was as well, even though they all changed a lot from that moment, but it lets you kind of encapsulate the theme, the idea, and the mood all in one. So it makes it feel like it's not going to get away. It's held right there. And also, I was telling my father this the other day. He also writes, and he was feeling extremely anxious about getting rid of an element of his novel that he really, really liked and really worked hard on. And I said, but you already wrote it once. You've done a great version of it. You've taken a picture of it, but it's like a tapestry of a great medieval hunting scene, and you've drawn a perfectly rendered pug in the middle of it. It might be an amazing pug, but when you step back, you're like, oh, shoot, pug does not belong. You can cut the pug out and you can always have that pug in your heart, but it's got to go. So in a way, the short story can be your pug, right? You can write it down. And then even as you build a tapestry around it, then you say, oh, right, okay.
And speaking of tapestry, art is such a huge element in Call Down the Hawk and Mr. Impossible. I know we talked a lot about John Sargent in the books. Is he your favorite artist, or do you have any favorite artist?
I always thought that I would be an illustrator. I would write children's books or kind of advertising illustrations, things like this. I never was really attracted to fine art. But then when I got out of college, I became an artist. And that was when I really fell in love with a lot of the older artists. And I love John Singer Sargent. I love the way that darkness informs his work. In many cases, instead of being attracted to the light part of the painting, you'll be interested in all of the dark, big masses of it instead. So for me, yeah, John Singer Sargent, I guess he's a favorite. I actually brought some more show and tell to show you some of my terrible art. So nowadays, you can find plenty of my current art on the internet now. So I'm not going to bother showing you any of my glorious, perfect art, but instead, I'm going to show you a thing that I did. One of the things that I used to do when I was a young baby novelist, and I mean, I was really a young baby novelist. I do not remember a time when I was not writing novels. I always had tons of novels that I was working on in various stages of completion. And I started to do these things called character conferences, where I would draw a picture of all of the characters from all of the books that I was currently working on in like a conference, in a convention together. Remember, I was a child. So that's my first one here. Yeah, here we go. Maybe one of the first ones. So this is terrible, but you'll notice that they're all on bleachers, right?
Nice.
There's a lot of tunics because there's a lot of medieval stuff. It's not good art, but there's that. And through the years, you can see as I got older, I kept on doing it. And you'll notice now I was writing thrillers, so there's helicopters and also some dragon situation.
Right.
What's happening? I guess that dragon was in the rewrite because there he is in the background there. They're all doing these things. I have no idea what's happening in this troubled time period. It looks like there's a giant stuffed bear, some circus tents. This is a bagpiper on fire. I don't know why there's an elephant there. And this is the last one I could find. You'll notice that we're starting to have more violence on them. Again, the elephants. Why are there elephants? We don't know. These are lost in the sands of time. But you'll notice this says April 3rd, 1999. I don't remember how old I was then. Probably old enough to know better.
Okay, and then obviously the best part of our show and tell today. What is the weirdest thing that you have in your office space?
This is a telephone. You'll notice it's not plugged into anything. It's a regular telephone. It's a rotary, fake rotary telephone. It's got proper buttons. It was a disaster from the beginning. It was a disaster in two ways. the first way it was a disaster was that it did not work. I did not realize it was possible for a phone to not work, but they laid the telephone line because there was no hard line here at the house. And then it never worked. When you picked up this phone, you just heard like a hissing, crackling sound. So eventually I just, out of frustration, I unplugged it. At least it's a good looking phone, right? So it can be there aesthetic. So I unplugged it, which is when it started to ring. So this year, no, not this year, this house, the first 2 years that we were here, every spring from April to May was the alarm time. Alarms were always going off. So at the end of April would always start, a fire alarm would go off, phone timers would go off, the timer on the microwave would go off, and it would always be for 2 weeks at the end of April to the beginning of the next month, alarms. And during this time, this phone would also ring. And remember, it's not plugged into the wall, and it's got this very shrill, old-fashioned ring. So I go running into the office before I realize, wait a second, who's calling? Like, who is calling? Now, I like to think that I'm a really brave person. However, I did not once pick up that phone. It has only rung 3 times in its life over those 2 years. 2 times the first year and 1 time the next time. And then it gave up. But I was not brave enough to pick it up any of those times. So who knows what was crackling at the other end. And after those years, after we had lived in the house long enough, none of the alarms went off anymore. Now spring comes and goes and there's no more of them. It was just those first 2 years of April and May, something wanted to be remembered. But since then, it has not rung and it just sits there remaining. So I think that's going to be the weirdest thing in my house, even though it gets less weird every year that it just is a telephone instead of the portal or whatever it was previously.
Has a story attached to it.
Yeah.
Do you have any theories of who was calling?
My gosh, so I was a Navy brat. I moved all over. However, I spent my summers here in the Shenandoah Valley with my grandmother, and I mean, just 6 miles away as the crow flies. I didn't realize it when I bought this house because I was little then, so I didn't recognize the area. We just immediately drove up this driveway and thought, oh, this feels like home. We feel so comfortable here. Later, we found out that one of my relatives, there's a 100-year-old barn down at the end of the driveway. One of my relatives did hang himself there.
Oh.
So my theory was maybe he just wanted to get in touch. Who knows? So congratulations, housewarming gift. Just want to let you know. I'm still hanging around. Punny, it was too dark. I'm sorry. Anyway.
And then this will be like my last question. I just saw the announcement for the next Disney book. How did that come to be? And like, what's the story behind that?
Disney went and reached out to my agent and said, would you ask Maggie if she'll write a sequel to Brave? And I did the exact same thing that you just did, which was, that is not a book that I knew that I wanted to write, but I want to write that book. Everything about the book feels like it was, in a really corny way, made just for me to write it, even though what's hilarious is that Disney didn't have any concept of my background other than me writing these sort of Celtic themed stories. They didn't know that I was a Scottish history major in college. They didn't know that I played the bagpipes. They didn't know that there are all of these connections that made Brave just feel like, oh, this is the world I definitely want to play with. Now, I can't talk too much about it, but I did love that as we were talking about the various amount of historical accuracy that we could put into this. Remember, I was a real history major, and so I knew a lot about real Scottish history. And of course, Disney movies are they're historical, right? They're vaguely truthful. It's a fairy tale. And I have no problem with fudging these kinds of things for novels. As long as you stay in the correct tone, you're not trying to pass it off as real, it's fine. But it was interesting because I remember that originally when I first pitched the novel, we had talked back and forth, and we had thought that maybe it would start with a wedding and with what were they doing? Yes, they're digging potatoes before a wedding. And so I had to have a call with them where I said, okay, bad news. There were no potatoes then. in Scotland. And also bad news, there were no weddings of the variety that you were hoping would be happening right then. They were not having weddings. They were not eating potatoes. In fact, they were stealing each other. And they were also, according to this document I found, eating each other as well. So possibly there were some Scottish tribes that were just really into cannibalism at that time. And so I said, do you think we can move the century a little bit? So we might have, we're not going to get potatoes, but maybe less cannibalism in Merida. And I thought, this is never a way that I thought that my career was going to go. It was going to go from tracksuits to cannibalism. Anyway, so yeah, it was really satisfying to be able to write it, especially because it took place a couple of years after the movie, which meant that I had enough time to sort of regroup, reintroduce everything that had happened, and really tell a totally brand new story instead of feeling like it's Brave, the reboot. Instead, it gets to be a Stiefvater book that's set in the Disney world, which very satisfying. And I also do have to say that I am appreciating that I am 2 degrees of separation or so from Emma Thompson now. I'm always trying to get closer to Emma Thompson, right? That's the goal.
Well, yeah.
Maybe that would be my new career peak.
From purple tracksuits to the belly button to Emma Thompson.
Yes.
Yeah. Pretty good peak. It was so nice to one-on-one meet you over Zoom, and I'm so excited for all the good things happening for you and all the good books.
Sounds amazing. Thank you so much.
Run, 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 kangaroo, oh, chin, chin, run, 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 kangaroo, oh.